ethics investigation into the conduct of 5 U.S. senators. He'll also talk to us about his future political ambitions and address rumors that he's considering another run for the White House.
Former Senator George McGovern, we've all been following the Senate Ethics Committee investigations. How would you evaluate the current state of ethics in the U.S. Senate?
Well, I think more so than at any other time in American history, politicians are under enormous pressure from special interest groups, primarily because of the growing power of money in American politics. Campaigns have grown inordinately expensive. When I first ran for the Congress back in 1956, I got elected with a campaign budget of $12,000. People would laugh at a budget like that today. The same congressional race out in my state today would probably cost $1 million for anyone who won that race in a hard contest. As the expense of campaigns have gone up, so has the role of special interest groups in financing those campaigns. And so senators and congressmen are spending an inordinately large amount of their time raising money the year around. It takes away from their performance of duty in the Congress. It eats up their time that they ought to be devoting to other things. And most disturbing of all, I think it makes it more and more difficult for them to take an independent position on the public issues that face the country. What's really involved here, as I see it, in this ethics investigation is not only the personal ethics of the senators involved, but also the campaign financing system that confronts all members of Congress. It's not a very ethical system. It's not a very desirable system. And that's what we have to really concentrate, I think, concentrate on in the months ahead, is reforming that campaign finance system.
Hello, welcome to C-SPAN. We're very pleased to have with us today former Senator George McGovern. We'll be talking about ethics in government, particularly taking a look at the ethics investigations in the U.S. Senate. We'll also be taking a look at the Persian Gulf and getting his views on what is developing there. If you have a question or comment for our guest, our telephone lines are open. The numbers are on the screen, and I'd like to remind you that if you've talked to C-SPAN within the past 30 days, we ask that you not call during this discussion. Senator, you said that it's difficult for the members to be independent given the enormous responsibility of raising money. How well equipped is the Senate to police itself when it comes to these ethical issues?
It's very tough to police itself in this area of campaign finance. Given the present system that we have for financing campaigns. As you know, we made a decision back in 1974 to provide a major part of the funding for presidential campaigns from the public treasury. That's the best possible investment the taxpayers could make, is to take private special interest money out of the presidential campaign and fund these campaigns with the same amount of public contributions both for the challenger and for the incumbent. We ought to do the same thing with the races in the House and the Senate. I think this present system just has built within it a conflict of interest. We're saying, in effect, to these congressmen and senators, go out and take all the money you can raise from every special interest group in Washington and across this country, but then try to make a fair judgment when those interests are on the line and you're supposed to legislate objectively and fairly for the American public. That's a very tough strain on the system.
How far should a senator go under the current system in assisting a contributor?
Well, first of all, a senator, even under the present system, bad as it is, has no excuse trying to represent a constituent who's attempting to break the law or to evade public regulations that other citizens are expected to follow. It's just simply unfair and unethical to use the power of a Senate office or a congressional office to browbeat some federal regulatory agency into exempting that special interest group from the laws and the regulations that pertain to the rest of us. Every American is entitled to be treated equally before the law. And when we break that principle, we're not only into the area of unethical conduct, we're in the area of illegality. And that's where I think we have to draw the line no matter what system we have in place.
Do you think that ethical standards have changed in the Senate since the days that you left?
I think they've changed in the sense that the money power has grown. It isn't that House and Senate members are any weaker or any more vulnerable or any more unethical than they were when I was a member of the House and Senate, but there's no question that the pressure of special interest groups through the giving of campaign contributions, through their access to congressional offices, is more of a problem today than it was 15, 20 years ago.
In case you've just joined us, we're visiting with former Senator George McGovern. Senator McGovern served in the Senate from 1963 until 1981. In 1972, he was the Democratic nominee for president and again was a candidate for president in 1984. Senator, before we go to the phones, I wanted to very quickly ask you about the Persian Gulf. Do you see any similarities between what's developing now in the Persian Gulf and this nation's experience in Vietnam?
There are, of course, some obvious differences between Iran and Vietnam, but one similarity that worries me greatly is that I think it's quite possible that we may again be making a commitment over there militarily that goes beyond any real interest we have. That was certainly true in Vietnam. We committed 550,000 troops to Vietnam in an area where our own national interest was very secondary. And I'm afraid of that possibility in Iran. I'm perfectly willing to support the sanctions against Saddam Hussein. I support the UN condemnation, the UN action in trying to boycott him and to cut off both export and import activity with Iraq. I think that's all to the good. It's highly doubtful in my mind whether we have an interest in the Persian Gulf that justifies going to war and risking the lives of tens of thousands of young Americans. That's why I would go slow on that. I don't think we have to follow any January 15th ultimatum as far as committing American forces. Let's give these sanctions a few months to work before we start needlessly shedding blood.
Bristol, Rhode Island, you're the first caller for our guest today, Senator George McGovern. Go ahead.
Senator McGovern, I agree with everything I've heard you say so far, but I have one question that's troubled me for some time now. Do you feel, as a leading Democrat, that the Democratic Party is giving the American people a real choice in opposition to policies of the administration, both now and in the past, as it deserves to have?
I do not. I think the Democratic Party, of which I'm a longtime member, and I'm proud to be a Democrat, is not performing its function of providing clear alternatives to the present direction of the country. This has been true, in my opinion, for about 10 years during the Reagan-Bush period. The Democrats regrettably went along with virtually all of the major recommendations of former President Reagan. The most serious being his recommendation that we cut taxes for the most affluent and prosperous citizens in this country. At the same time, we were increasing military spending substantially. I think a lot of those military increases were unnecessary. They contributed really nothing to our national defense, but they were enormously expensive, and they came in the face of declining revenues because of the tax cut. The result is, in the last 10 years of the Reagan-Bush era, with the cooperation of the Democrats, I regret to say, we have tripled our national debt. We didn't have much debate on the savings and loan scandal that was gathering strength over the last 5 or 6 years. We still don't have much clear-cut debate on that issue. So I think in those areas and elsewhere, the Democratic Party is not performing its function of laying out a clear alternative national agenda for the American public.
Springfield, Missouri. Go ahead. You've got Senator George McGovern.
Yes, sir. I call as a 22-year-old straight-ticket Republican voter, largely as a result of Ronald Reagan and of the Democratic Party's willingness to follow the policies that you helped to lay down in the late 60s and early 70s. I would like to ask, although I'd like to salute the Democratic congressman you had on earlier today and Les Aspin, some of the Democrats that aren't willing to follow a pacifist, weak defense policy. I'd like to ask Senator McGovern, why is it that the Democratic Party and you are so unwilling to admit that regardless of past politics, that oil is and always will be, until we find another energy source, a very important resource, and this situation is worth the current president's policy, which I wholeheartedly support.
That's a perfectly legitimate question. First of all, since the subject of pacifism was raised by the gentleman, I think I should make it clear that I was a bomber pilot in the Second World War. I flew 35 combat missions against the Nazis in Germany. I have no regret about that. That was a war that had to be fought. The future of Western civilization was on the line. There's no question in my mind Hitler was out to take over the world. In a similar circumstance, if I had the strength to do it, I would volunteer again, just as I did after Pearl Harbor some 40 more years ago. I suppose where this charge originates, that some of us in the Democratic Party are more interested in pacifism than we are anything else, is that we opposed the war in Vietnam. I think that war was a disastrous mistake. It was not in our national interest. The same kind of patriotism that led me to volunteer against Hitler led me to speak out publicly against our involvement in Vietnam. I wish I had been more effective and had been there earlier in speaking out against our military involvement in Vietnam. I recognize the oil interest in the Persian Gulf. Kuwait produces about 2% of the world's oil production, Iraq about 5%. We've already offset any loss from the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait by increased production in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates. So the oil interest, at least for the time being, has been secured. Beyond that, I don't object to the president having forces in Saudi Arabia to deter an attack in Saudi Arabia. What I object to is us losing our patience, losing our cool, and going to war in an aggressive, offensive attack on Iraq, trying to dislodge them from Kuwait before we've given the sanctions a chance to work. I don't even think at this stage that there's any interest, oil or otherwise, that justifies us waging an offensive war in the Persian Gulf. I say that as one who feels very strongly my obligation as a public figure to be careful about American blood. It's not my blood that's going to be shed out in the Persian Gulf if war comes. I'm worried about these young men and young women out there in Saudi Arabia whose lives are on the line. I'm worried about my 7 grandchildren whose lives are in the balance, and that's why I want us to be cautious about committing American forces until we've tried every other resource.
Lake Tahoe, California. Go ahead. You've got C-SPAN.
Good evening, Senator. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
I listen to you constantly. I have a problem with us being in Saudi Arabia for the simple reason we have our men over there that were forced to take off their American flags off their uniforms. We're not allowed to practice our religion over there. We're taking 71% of the expense for this royal family. And I have a question for you that relates to President Bush. He says the world is against Hussein. Now, how much did we pay all these countries? We made a deal with China. We made a deal with Russia. We've made deals all over. I think somebody, some Democrat or somebody, should tell us the truth, what's going on over there. Would you please help us? Thank you very much.
Well, there's no question at all that we've had to make major concessions to other countries to get their support in this venture. For example, President Bush has recommended that we forgive a $7.5 billion debt on the part of Egypt that is owed to the United States for previous military equipment and other things that we sent over there. We've recently provided another $1 billion in aid recommended by the President to Syria. Other forms of assistance have been provided to Turkey to get them to cooperate in this. Now, frankly, I'm not against the President trying to line up an international collective security arrangement against aggression. What I think we've done, though, is to press the military option too far. We don't need 450,000 American forces in Saudi Arabia to deter an Iraqi attack on Saudi Arabia. When I saw this recommendation a month or so ago that the President was going to send another 200,000 Americans over there, what I saw building up was not the defense of Saudi Arabia, but preparations for an aggressive war against Iraq. And that's why I, along with Senator Nunn of Georgia, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and others, began warning against that option before we've given the sanctions a fair chance to work.
Wyckoff, New Jersey. Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, Senator. It's an honor to be speaking to you, such a fair and just man.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
You know, I really hope after this crisis is over that the U.S. will apply the UN resolutions concerning Palestine with the same vigor and force like you are applying to Iraq, because it's only fair to end the suffering of the people of Palestine and to allow their freedom in their own homeland. What do you think about this, Senator? And do you think that our government should apply more force on pressuring Israel to end the occupation of the Palestinian people and to give them their rights for self-determination in their own land?
Yes, I think that position is substantially right. It is, after all, the official position of the United States. We haven't pursued it as vigorously as we should have, but officially we support UN Resolution 242 that has been in effect now for some 20 years. And the purpose of that resolution is to restore the boundaries of the Middle East as they were prior to the 1967 war. That means that at some point Israel will be called upon to withdraw from the so-called occupied territories, the West Bank, the Gaza area, the Golan Heights. And I think that is a position that in the long run is in the interest of Israel as well as the Palestinians. It would open the way for an independent Palestinian state located on the West Bank and the Gaza area. I do think that would have to be accompanied by a clear commitment on the part of the Arab states and the Palestinians to recognize the permanent independence of Israel and the right of that country to live in peace, to live in freedom, and to carry out its religious views. It may also require some security guarantee from the United States and the United Nations backing up whatever boundaries are eventually agreed upon. But just as I believe the state of Israel is entitled to an independent state of its own, I think the same right of self-determination has to be offered to the Palestinians.
Before we continue with our calls, I'd like to point out that our guest, Senator George McGovern, served in the Senate from 63 to 81. During that time, he served as chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, also was the chairman of the African Affairs Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to that, he was director of U.S. Food for Peace and was a member of the House of Representatives from 1956 to 1960. What district did you represent?
I had the eastern half of South Dakota, what we call the East River district. It's east of the Missouri River up to the Minnesota line.
Phoenix, Arizona, thanks for standing by. Go ahead.
Hello, George McGovern.
Hello.
You are one of my political heroes.
Thank you.
It's amazing after your brief retirement compared to your statesmanship and charitable nature and what you've been doing in the general public compared to Mr. Reagan and what he's doing in Japan is just incomprehensible. But I want you to comment, please, if you would, on a couple politicians, and also if you would define the word liberal, and also comment on Barry Goldwater from Arizona, Evan Mecham, Ann Richards, and Newt Gingrich. And be good.
Well, the one of those three that I know best is my old colleague in the Senate, Barry Goldwater. Believe it or not, he and I are longtime personal friends. We have a most affable relationship. We don't agree on a lot of the issues, but one of the things that we have in common is that we both say what we think on public questions. When I was defeated overwhelmingly in 1972 by Richard Nixon, I got a call from Barry Goldwater, and he sent over a cartoon. It was a modification of that old American Gothic painting showing the farmer and the farmer's wife standing there grimly holding pitchforks, and someone had written Goldwater and McGovern under these two figures, referring to his big loss to Lyndon Johnson in '64 and my big loss to Richard Nixon in '72. And he wrote under that picture, "Dear George, if you must lose, lose big." And he later told me what he meant by that is stand by your convictions. Whether you get a majority of the vote or not, you're going to feel better if you've said exactly what you think on public issues. I've never forgotten that, and so I admire him. I don't know Governor Mecham. I've never met him. I have no real knowledge other than what I've read in the press about him. I've debated Newt Gingrich several times on public television. He's a formidable debater. I disagree very strongly with a number of his views, but I must say he's a formidable adversary.
Senator, before we go back to the phones, I did want to follow that up briefly. We started out talking about ethics in government, ethics in the Senate. Did you follow the campaigns around the country this last time around? And if so, what did you think of the ethical conduct in general of the candidates across the nation?
I thought some of them were just plain political disasters. You know, it's disturbing to me as one who believes very strongly in the American political process to see it distorted and corroded the way it has been in recent elections, where we avoid the central issues. Keep in mind that in this election in 1990, which was just a little over a month ago, almost none of the congressmen and senators discussed the issue of the Persian Gulf. It was as though that issue didn't exist. It reminded me of what happened in the presidential election in 1988 when there was no discussion of the S&L crisis. The S&L scandal, I should call it, the worst scandal in American history. Something is happening in American politics when politicians in both congressional and presidential races concentrate more on mudslinging, on little personal things that have nothing to do with the central issues before the country than they do the great issues that disturb this country. There are a lot of major problems before the United States. I felt in the 1990 congressional elections, most of those problems were evaded, they were avoided, they weren't discussed. Too much mudslinging to suit me on picayunish little personal things that really are of no fundamental interest either to anybody in this world or the next.
Santa Barbara, California, thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Hello, Senator. I have a question. Are you familiar with former CIA Chief Bureau Officer John Stockwell?
Well, I know about his work. I've read some of the things that he has written. He wrote a major book here several years ago, which I've read, so I am somewhat familiar with his work.
Good. I just saw a public TV program with him on there, and he was saying some pretty disturbing things about the Reagan administration and also with the Bush administration, especially with the Iran-Contra scandal that was going on, with him being aware of the scandaling with the drugs coming on over to fund the Contra support.
Well, he's a thoughtful man, and he's worth listening to. I haven't reviewed everything he has to say, but I've read some things I found very interesting and helpful to me in giving insight on what's going on behind the scenes.
New York City, go ahead.
Yes. Hello, Senator. I just want to say admirer of not only you, but of the entire Senate you sat with, Senator Humphrey, Muskie, Church, and Baez. I don't think a Senate like that will ever return. But anyway, I have a couple of questions for you. One is, do you think the Tax Reform Act of 1986 had a negative impact on the real estate industry and played a role in the savings and loan crisis? And two, do you think would you classify Jordan as a Palestinian state?
With regard to the first question, I think the value of that 1986 Tax Reform Act was greatly exaggerated. It still did not resolve the problem of a fair and equitable system. It's quite possible it contributed somewhat to the problems you mentioned. It was supposed to be a stimulative tax to American business. It was supposed to simplify the tax code. Most of the people that I've talked with who've had experience with that tax code, if anything, thinks it made it more complicated, more difficult for people to know where they stand, more difficult to know what the possible benefits are, what the possible write-offs are. So I don't think it was all that great as a piece of tax legislation. What was the other?
He was asking about whether or not Jordan is a Palestinian state.
No, Jordan is not a Palestinian state. It's obviously a royal monarchy headed by King Hussein. There are a great many Palestinians who live there, more than in any other Arab country, but it's obviously not a substitute for a sovereign, independent Palestinian state.
McLean, Virginia, go ahead.
Good evening, Senator. I've been listening with interest to the questions of the Persian Gulf and the Palestinian questions. I would like to ask you a question regarding Mr. Baker's comment around a month ago that the lifeline of America passes through the Middle East, which makes the Middle East and its people, mainly the Arabs, very important to America, and therefore I think you mentioned just now the resolution 242, which stayed without any execution for almost 23 years. Mm-hmm. Don't you think we should treat with fairness and remove the bitterness that most Arabs have towards America because of the Palestinian cause, which I think is the only cause that unites all the Arabs? I think it's time we do it, and whether there is linkage between the Iraqi issue or the Palestinian issue, it has certainly come out to the surface at this moment. Thank you.
Yes, I do indeed. I think that's an issue that has cried out for greater attention and leadership on the part of the states in the Middle East and also on the part of the United States than it has yet received. One of the reasons we need to address the Palestinian question, which is at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict, is that we're unwittingly being drawn into an arms race in the Middle East over that issue. It's now being proposed that we supply some $23 billion in sophisticated armaments to Saudi Arabia, partly in answer to Saddam Hussein's military challenge. This has frightened the Israelis, who are now asking for more arms. I mentioned earlier that we'd forgiven $7.5 billion in previous arms transfers to Egypt. Now the Israelis are asking us to forgive some of the earlier commitments of arms obligations to them, so that in a sense we're beginning to fuel an arms race both among the Arab states and the State of Israel. I think what we need to do is, working through the United Nations, bring all of these conflicting parties together in an international conference, doubtless an international conference where you can get some one-on-one bilateral discussions going between the Arab states and the Palestinians on one hand and the Israelis on the other. But that's a matter of very high priority, and I fully agree with the implication of your question that we need to put more pressure and persuasion on our dealings with the Israelis to bring them into active negotiations looking towards a settlement of this question.
San Diego, California, thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Hi, Senator. I'm very honored to be speaking with you right now. I'd like to say that I am 19 years old right now, and I'm a part of a new generation of young people that's coming up right now. We were young people during we were teenagers during the 80s, which we were personally, most of us are absolutely sick of. We've seen all the greed and materialism and all the lack of values, and we saw the country basically morally bankrupt during the 1980s. and monetarily bankrupt at the end of the 1980s. And now we see that we're being asked to go and fight for a tiny little country that is a constitutional monarchy. And we know that it's not for democracy, that's for certain. Mm-hmm. It's for one, and we all know that it's for oil. Earlier, a caller admitted that it's about oil. And we are not going to go fight this kind of an oil war. A lot of the young people in this country see it as just as fighting an oil war is basically fighting a money war, just fighting a war for a few rich oil executives back at home. And we're not going to go and fight it. Basically, our ethic right now is hell no, we won't go, which is very much like what it was in the 60s. And all I can say is that Vietnam was just a warm-up. That is the protest movement. Because believe me, this generation of young people, of people old enough to be drafted, are definitely not going to go and fight an oil war. And I have one question. I'd like to know what you would think if say on the 13th or 14th of January, Saddam Hussein said, "I will not get out of Kuwait unconditionally, but I will get out of all of Kuwait except say these 2 islands or these 2 oil fields, but not unconditionally." Then that is not pull out unconditionally before then. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, let me say I wish very much that Saddam Hussein would seize on the opportunity the Bush administration has given him to get into negotiations now. The Bush people say that they're not going over there to negotiate, but the fact is they are. One of the reasons that President Bush proposed sending Mr. Baker to Baghdad was to provide an opportunity for some kind of discussion to take place, and perhaps this formula that you suggest is one that could be discussed. I would hope that Saddam Hussein would not sit around and do nothing until the 14th of January and then announce, well, I'm finally going to get out, but I'm going to keep everything I wanted that led to the invasion in the first place. Those are subjects that at some day may go on the negotiating table involving Kuwait and Iraq particularly. But as matters now stand, I don't think he's conducting himself very responsibly and turning down, apparently, an opportunity for negotiations right now or in the next couple of weeks that I think have the potential of avoiding war in the Middle East. I wish the Iraqi foreign minister had gone forward with the original proposal that he come here. I don't disagree with some of the things you have said. I know the young people of this country don't have much stomach for going to war over oil in the Middle East. I don't have much enthusiasm about that prospect either. I would like to suggest another positive step that I wish we had taken long ago, and that's to begin breaking our dependence on Middle East oil. We've known since 1973, when the first oil embargo went into effect, that we were in a dangerous position being as dependent as we are on Middle East oil. We should have been using these last 17 years to develop alternative sources of energy, to develop an energy policy that freed us from some of the dependence that we now talk about with regard to Middle East oil. That's one of the safest investments we can make, both in protecting our environment and also in protecting our young people against the possibility that they'll be sent to the Middle East in order to safeguard oil interests.
Senator, as a former college student who was on campuses during the years when you were leading your opposition to the Vietnam War, and someone who remembers how much support you had on college campuses across the country, I wonder if you could quickly compare the moral fiber of the young people today versus those when you were a candidate for president?
Well, the basic moral fiber of the young people of this country is as good as it was in the 1960s. There's no issue today that inspires and challenges and motivates young people as intensely as the Vietnam War did. That issue, more than any issue in my lifetime, generated a virtual revolution on the campuses of this country. All over America, north, south, east, and west. We don't have anything comparable to that today, but I will say this, young people on the campuses are beginning to stir again. They're concerned about the Persian Gulf War possibility. They're concerned about the deterioration of the environment. They're concerned about the skyrocketing cost of education, particularly higher education in the United States. They're concerned about drugs. They're concerned about homelessness. They're concerned about South Africa. These are some of the issues that I find young people on our campuses expressing with increasing frequency.
Corpus Christi, Texas. Go ahead. You've got Senator George McGovern.
Hello, Senator McGovern. It's an honor to speak to you.
Thank you.
My question the question I have is a follow-up to a comment you made earlier. If let's say that Saddam Hussein did pull back and things went back to a scenario as that they were before August,
yes.
Don't you think that since the Saudis will owe us a great favor, that we could be looking at oil prices in the neighborhood of $10 a barrel or something in that neighborhood? And don't you think that would further hostagize us, to coin a word, in the future, and it would not permit conservation and development of alternative forms of energy?
Well, that's always a possibility. I think you're aware of the fact that over the last 15, 20 years, the Saudis have usually taken the lead in OPEC in trying to hold down the oil price, at least to a more moderate level than some of the oil-producing countries have advocated. That's probably in our interest that they do that. What bothers me is the point you make that each time we've had what was referred to as an oil glut or cheap oil prices, we've used that as an excuse to stop our effort to develop alternative sources of energy. Somehow, it seems like under our system we almost have to be hurting before we see the importance of action. I would hope, given the experience we've had in this Persian Gulf crisis, that both our political leaders and also the American public would support more vigorously from here on out a policy for developing alternative sources of energy, no matter what the Saudis do in terms of the oil price.
Pittsburgh, Massachusetts. Go ahead. You've got Senator George McGovern.
Senator McGovern, first I have to tell you my father, who's nearing his 80s and unfortunately suffers from Alzheimer's disease, was a delegate for you in Miami.
I'm glad to hear that.
And from Pennsylvania. And I led a group of high school students out to Wisconsin, where you won the primary.
Thank you.
But I'd like to just ask you this in terms of today's world that we're living in. South Africa. Here we stand on the verge of war in Saudi Arabia. And I'm questioning the level of the U.S. commitment to the outrages that have just gone on for so many years in South Africa. What should be U.S. policy at this point, and how come we're so able to commit troops every place in the world and yet unable to apply the kind of pressures needed in South Africa?
And caller, I should point out before our guest answers that Senator McGovern did serve as the chairman of the African Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
I had the privilege of being chairman both of the African Affairs Subcommittee and then for a while chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East when I served as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. I, frankly, am somewhat encouraged by developments in South Africa over the last 2 or 3 years. I think the present government in South Africa is obviously the best one we've seen in more than half a century. Mr. de Klerk has entered into a dialogue with the African National Congress leaders. He has arranged for the freeing of Nelson Mandela and scores of other political prisoners. It's true, there's still a lot of violence in South Africa, some of it between blacks themselves rather than a white-black confrontation. And I suspect we'll continue to see some turbulence and infighting there for a long time to come. But looking down the road and even looking back to where we've come, I think there's been considerable progress made in South Africa. It's not the most discouraging and pessimistic scene in the world today. It's an area where considerable progress has been made, and I would hope, as your question implies, that we won't get so involved in an obsession with the Persian Gulf we forget about our responsibility to continue to push for reform and a greater measure of political and economic freedom in South Africa.
Would you favor the lifting of sanctions now?
It's a little premature maybe on the lifting of sanctions, but I think they've already had a constructive impact. There's no doubt in my mind they had something to do with the decision of the present government to grant a greater measure of freedom to blacks in South Africa. Spokane,
Washington, you're the last caller. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm in opposition to Senator McGovern. I believe his appearance here is self-serving. I read in the paper the other day that he's putting together a committee to see if he's going to run for the presidency again. And I'd also like to say that we've still got missing in action in Vietnam, and you know what's going to happen in the Middle East there if we go to war. Obviously, we got 450,000 troops over there, or going to have. You know, there's going to be some missing. Are we going to do anything about that? Just like we haven't done in Vietnam.
I guess probably the best way to prevent missing in action in the Persian Gulf is not to go to war there. The reason we had so many missing in action and killed in action in South Vietnam is that we committed several million Americans over a period of some 15 years to combat in South Vietnam, an area where I think our national interest was only marginally involved. I never believed in that war. I think it was not in our national interest. But if we're concerned about those missing in action, and all of us ought to be concerned about that in every war. My navigator on my bomber crew in World War II was missing in action in World War II. We never found him. We still don't know what happened. So every war has its missing in action, and tragically enough, they all have their killed in action and wounded in action. And it's the memory of that that makes me cautious about committing American forces to combat in the Persian Gulf. I think we need to give these sanctions a chance to work. Keep in mind, when the President invoked sanctions last August, he said at that time it might take 6 months or a year before we'll know whether the sanctions are working or not. Now, after 3.5 or 4 months, he's laying down an ultimatum that we may go to war, that the sanctions haven't worked, and the time has come to consider a major military attack. I think that's premature, and I think it's one that we ought to avoid for the time being.
Senator, was the caller from Spokane correct? Are you contemplating a run for president again?
Well, I had an interview here last Friday, I guess it was, with a couple of young reporters from the Boston Herald, and they asked me if I would ever think about running for president again, if I would look at 1992. I said to them that I was surprised with less than 13 months to go before the first test out there in Iowa. We don't have any candidates out moving around or acting like they're interested in becoming involved. I suspect we will have such candidates in due course. But I said I thought the country was on the wrong course, both here at home economically, where we're in serious problems, serious difficulties, and abroad, and that if no other candidate emerges here pretty soon with views similar to mine, I might very well raise the standard again. I haven't made that decision. It'd probably be better to get somebody younger and with less scars than I've had from a previous race. But maybe at some point, if no one else does it, I'll get in there and raise the standard and try to lay out the issues that I think are important to the country. I don't know whether I can be nominated or not, but I certainly won't know if I don't try. If I can't be nominated, maybe raising those issues will help whoever is the eventual nominee look at what I think ought to be the central problems we debate in 1992.
Senator, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thanks very much for joining us. We've been visiting with former Senator George McGovern. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your calls. We'll continue in just a moment with our call-in program, where we'll be joined by Representative Butler Derrick to discuss his recent trip to the Persian Gulf.
At the end of each week, the top news stories are reviewed by a group of journalists and C-SPAN viewers. Tune in for a re-air of the Journalist Roundtable call-in program, Saturdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. on the West Coast.
As a service to schools, C-SPAN airs Short Subject, a 10-minute program each Tuesday beginning at 1 a.m. Eastern Time. Short Subjects are educational vignettes that explain how government works and look at personalities and issues in the news. Short Subject